Welcome, everyone, to EWG's expert panel on the topic of storing carbon in the soil. Is it the answer to cutting agriculture's contribution to climate change? My name is Ken Cook. I'm president and co-founder of EWG, and I'm thrilled to have all of you join us today for what I hope will be a really important conversation about the science of soil carbon and its relevance to the policy considerations that we'll be pondering over the next few years as we head into the 2023 Farm Bill. EWG will turn 30 next year, and one of the constants over those decades has been our dedication to the idea that funding USDA conservation programs is one of the most important things government does to protect the environment. In the case of Craig Cox and myself, the commitment goes back even further to the intensive research and advocacy that preceded the 1985 Farm Bill, the conservation title of which forms the foundation of the multi-billion-dollar conservation investments in soil, water quality, and wildlife protection that the government makes today in support of farmers' voluntary conservation efforts. So we're deeply proud of that long-term work and our unwavering commitment to it in every Farm Bill cycle for almost 40 years. No organization, whether farm or environmental, has done more to secure and defend the Farm Bill's conservation programs and funding. I don't say that really to brag, it's just part of our DNA. And that core commitment hasn't changed. As we look to the 2023 Farm Bill cycle, we welcome the growing interest in finding ways to address the enormous challenges agriculture faces with climate change, the role that farmers can play to reduce climate gases, and the vital need to help farmers adapt to a climate that human activity is already changing, bringing more severe weather with every growing season. Agriculture became a salient topic in climate circles with the 4 per 1,000 proposal of French Minister of Agriculture Stéphane Le Foll at the COP21 held in Paris in 2015. The idea was that increasing soil carbon in agricultural soils by 4% a year would significantly reduce carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Now, we're here today to examine crucial scientific questions raised by this focus on soil carbon as we head into the 2023 Farm Bill debate. And we're joined by 4 real scientific experts in this topic. And we look forward to your questions and reactions. And you do that by hitting the Q&A button on the lower right side of your screen, typing in your question there. The questions will be anonymous. We'll just read out the ones that we're able to select. And Craig Cox will serve as the moderator of the panel. And he's the first person I want to introduce. Craig Cox is Senior Advisor for Agriculture and Environmental Policy at EWG. Craig will moderate the panel as we proceed. Craig has spent decades in government service, research, and advocacy when I think of leaders at the intersection of agriculture and the environment. My friend Craig Cox is right at the top of the list. In particular, I would call your attention to just one of his many contributions, a consensus report from the National Academies of Science in 1993, Soil and Water Quality, an Agenda for Agriculture. That report reads very well today in light of the concerns we have about soil conservation, soil erosion, the role of soil carbon, and the way they intersect to affect water quality. Craig was the project director for that pioneering work at the Academy. Now, joining Craig are 3 distinguished soil scientists and professors. We'll hear, I'll introduce all 3 of them, and then we'll go straight to the panel. First is Randy Jackson. He's Campbell Bascom Professor of Grassland Ecology in the Department of Agronomy at the University of Wisconsin at Madison. Among many other things, Randy helps direct the Wisconsin Integrated Cropping Systems Trial, a 30-year-old experiment comparing ecosystem outcomes in cash grain, dairy forage, and grassland agro ecosystems. Next, we'll hear from Mike Castellano, the William T. Frankenberger Professor of Soil Science at Iowa State University. Mike uses a systems approach to increase cropping systems productivity, profitability, and environmental performance, and he has a particular interest in nitrogen because nitrogen frequently limits crop production, but is easily lost to the environment, a loss economically to farmers and damaging to air and water quality. And then we'll hear from Anna Cates. Anna is extension professor of the Department of Soil, Climate, and Water at the University of Minnesota. She is also Minnesota's first state soil health specialist in the Minnesota Office for Soil Health, which is dedicated to improving soil health in the state by working with farmers and conservation professionals. So I want to thank these three professors for taking time out of their crazy hectic schedules to educate the reporters and the congressional staff who are gathered on this call. Let's turn it over now to Randy Jackson. Randy, welcome.
Thank you so much, Ken. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's a super important topic that I know we're all passionate about. So I appreciate the opportunity to talk a little bit about the work that we've been doing in Wisconsin and the upper Midwest. As Ken mentioned, I helped direct the Wisconsin Integrated Cropping Systems Trial, and I need to call out Dr. Josh Posner, who passed away 6 or 7 years ago now, who established this experiment in 1989. It's about a 30-acre experiment with, as Ken mentioned, many cropping systems comparisons, and it just was really ahead of its time. And the older it gets, the more important and valuable the experiment is. So a lot of what I'll talk about today is sort of results that have come as a result of Josh laying that groundwork. Janet Hedke helped Josh run that experiment for many years, and then his grad student, Josh's grad student, Greg Sanford, still works with me and manages the experiment and really has produced a lot of the data that I'm going to share today. So my title is, Are there ag systems that build soil carbon? And this is one of the things we've been exploring. And let me just come right to the takeaways, jump right to the conclusions here, and then I'll try and support these conclusions with some data. The first takeaway is that there's a difference between carbon accumulating and carbon being sequestered in the soil. And this is an important distinction because we can pretty readily kind of account for whether it's accumulating by looking at the inputs of carbon and the outputs of carbon, and wave our arms about whether or not carbon is being lost or gained. But there are important dynamics within the soil itself that we also have to look at to try and understand whether or not that carbon's actually sort of stabilized and sequestered in the soil, or there's some possibility that it's just going to be lost very quickly. So they're related things, but they're different and they're quite precarious. And so I want to talk a little bit about that. There are a lot of methodological concerns with the research that's out there. It's not to say that the research that's out there is not good. It's just that some of the inferences that are drawn from some of the work are overdrawn, let's just say. And so I want to just talk very briefly about some of the methodology issues and how they relate to carbon accounting schemes. And then finally, my drum to beat as a grassland ecologist, but with data to support it, is that our best and maybe our only opportunity to really help mitigate climate change in agricultural soils is with grazed grasslands that are managed with grazing very well. So there are ways to do grazing on grasslands that undermine its ability to accumulate carbon or hold on to carbon. And so it's really important that we understand what good management of grazing is. By the way, not only might this be our best opportunity to store soil carbon, also is our best opportunity to improve water quality and reduce flooding frequency and intensity and enhance biodiversity and create opportunities for young diverse farmers, et cetera, et cetera. So it just offers all kinds of great opportunities. So soil carbon accumulation, this difference between the inputs and the outputs of carbon, is precarious, and I'm going to try and distill this rather messy graph that Howard Skinner produced way back in 2008, but it's a beautiful plot showing grass and alfalfa net ecosystem exchange of carbon, which is to say all the carbon coming in and all the carbon going out at a particular time. And the circles and the two lines up on the top are the gains of carbon into the system. It's the photosynthetic gains from the plant material. And what you can see here as you look across time is that there are in the springtime, and we're right in the middle of this, that ramp up and greening of the agricultural system is a critical time for carbon gain. That's constantly being offset by carbon loss. And the carbon loss is really microbial respiration in the soil. The microbes are getting at the carbon that's in the soil and respiring it off to the atmosphere as CO2. And so the balance between these inputs and outputs are really the net balance of carbon in the system. And that's what the black line is indicating here. And I think it's important to note that there's just this really pretty narrow window of time in the northern part of the country here, where carbon is actually accumulating in the system, and a big part of the year where carbon is actually on net being lost. And so you can imagine if there are things that we do to the agri-ecosystem during this green period that reduce its capacity to accumulate carbon, we pretty much set that system on course to lose carbon that particular year. Likewise, if there are things we do to stimulate microbial activity during these red periods of time, then we're really setting ourselves up for carbon losses. And what are we doing with climate change? We're stimulating microbial activity in the winter, and we're stimulating microbial activity at nighttime. It's warmer at night, it's warmer in the winters, and as a result, we're stimulating microbes while we're not really stimulating plants. So we're set up in a precarious situation to begin with. But I mentioned that it's not just this input-output balance. What's also really critical is what happens within the soil. And so we're trying to accumulate soil organic matter carbon. The inputs, as I mentioned, are the CO2 coming in through plant production. Those plants die, the roots turn over, they ooze carbon into the soil. All of that dead plant material becomes what we call particulate organic matter, which is really just, if you looked at it under a scope, you'd see little plant cells. That's part of the soil organic matter pool. But eventually the microbes are going to get at that particulate organic matter to build their own bodies. And then when their bodies die, it becomes necromass. And what's really important is that that necromass is kind of a gooey, sticky material. There are a lot of enzymes that they ooze out to try and get at that carbon. And as a result, they glom together pieces of the mineral soil, the clay, the silt, et cetera. And that mineral associated organic matter, the organic matter sort of glommed on to those mineral particles is really what we consider to be the most stabilized kind of carbon and really kind of sequestered carbon. So it's important that when we talk about carbon sequestration, we're kind of focusing on the quality, if you will, of the soil organic matter. And so, of course, as I mentioned before, the microbial outputs are a big part of the loss here. So the microbes are getting at not only the particulate organic matter, they're going to keep working on the mineral associated organic matter. And as a result, there's this heterotrophic respiration of CO2. So critically, MAOM, mineral associated organic matter, it saturates, as you can see here in this plot on the left. The blue are grasslands, the red are forests. And so as the amount of carbon in the soil accumulates, there is sort of a limit, a bound on how much mineral associated organic matter there could be, because there's a limit on how many mineral particles there are in the soil. Unless we add silt and clay to the system, which is not really a relevant thing in agriculture, there's only so much carbon we can accumulate as MAOM. This is a very controversial topic. I don't want to make it sound like that's the last word on it. There's a lot of discussion about, well, maybe there could be layering on top of the mineral organic matter, et cetera. This is really the frontier of soil science. Super exciting. But there is sort of a capacity, I think, at which MAOM can accumulate. Whereas POM, this particular organic matter that again is just a broken down dead plant material, that could theoretically continue to accumulate. In fact, we see this a lot in some systems where we just kind of build up organic matter. But what's important is that that POM eventually is going to be broken down by microbes. Eventually, the microbes are going to get at that POM. Let me transition now to methodological challenges. And there are really 4 big challenges that I want to point out. And I'm picking on this one study, but it's certainly not alone. But the first challenge is that there's a lot of literature out there that's kind of incomplete carbon accounting. And so here's an example where they went to all this effort to calculate all the carbon losses as a result of machinery use and herbicide production and fertilizers, et cetera. And then the net carbon gain, indicated here by this kind of beige coloring, is really just the NPP part, the plant production part. They've made no attempt to estimate what's being lost as microbial respiration. And yet this study was pitched as, here is the net carbon gain, and hence the net carbon sequestration for this corn system, for this soybean cotton system, et cetera. So we have to be careful there. We have to be careful about studies that talk about carbon change over time, but haven't really estimated carbon change over time. And so there are a lot of these studies in the literature. I've published several of these. They're important, but we have to recognize them for what they are, where they substitute space for time. And they look at a particular time, look at some improved management, let's say cover crops, let's say no-till, and compare that to a system where those improved management techniques weren't applied. And we talk about a carbon difference, an apparent soil carbon gain. But if we had actually watched from some original time, some baseline soil carbon stock, we might have actually seen that the degraded system lost carbon while the improved system gained carbon. And so we're overestimating the amount of carbon gain for the improved system. Likewise, if both systems lost carbon overall, we might also infer that one of the systems gained carbon. So we just have to be careful about space for time substitutions and really look at systems or experiments where we look at carbon actually over time. We have the same kind of issue with soil depth, and this is from our integrated cropping systems trial work. Many, if not most, of the soil carbon papers out in the literature focus on the surface 15 or 30 centimeters of soil. And if we had done that with our WIXT data, we would have concluded that our pasture system was gaining carbon over time, that our forage systems didn't change, and that our grain systems lost carbon over time. But when we actually look across the entire soil profile and add all that up, what we really concluded was that the pasture didn't change significantly over time, because while it gained in the surface horizons, it lost at depth. And so on net, there was no change in that system. So it's not to say that just looking in the surface soils isn't important and interesting, but if we're going to do carbon accounting, we better go all the way down to the full depth of the soil and really account for the change that's the result of that management. Finally, there's an issue with the density of the soil when we sample. And so if there are things that we do in the agricultural system that compact the soil, we have to be very careful about the way we sample the soil, and this often isn't done. And so this can get pretty convoluted, but the idea here is that the yellow squares here in this soil sample are the mineral soil, the clay and the mineral and the sand particles. These darker squares are the carbon, which are identical over here on the right, but the soil has been compacted. So if we take the same size soil core and pierce it down through that soil, we're probably going to sample a bigger volume of soil overall, and our concentration as a result will increase, even though the amount of carbon hasn't really changed. And that can result in a very big difference in the estimation of soil carbon. And so the way we correct for that is with what's called an equivalent soil mass correction. Many of the studies in the literature have not done this. And it really is a fairly recent development that folks have been focusing on this. So let me just wrap up by talking about some of the work from our Wisconsin Integrated Cropping Systems trial, where we have, I think, addressed these 4 methodological issues because it is a long-term system. We've actually looked over time, we've looked across depth, we've corrected for equivalent soil mass, and we've tried to do the full accounting. WIXT is comparing 3 cash grain systems and 3 dairy forage systems. I'm not going to get into the details of all of them. You can see there are different rotations. These gold rotations are organic managed rotations. And then we have a cool season perennial grassland that's grazed by dairy heifers. There's 4 replications of each system in every phase, every year. So it's about 76 plots out on the landscape, as I was talking about earlier. We take these 1 meter deep soil cores, which Josh and his colleagues did in 1989, and then Greg did again in 2009. We now have the 2019 data, but I'm not going to share those today because my grad student is feverishly working them up. But what Greg found between 1989 and 2009 was that the change in soil carbon in all of the systems except for the pasture was negative. That is to say, they were all losing about 25 grams of carbon per meter squared per year. This is a lot of carbon. They were losing a significant amount of carbon to the atmosphere. Whereas the pasture was, as I said earlier, not significantly changing. So it was holding on to whatever carbon it had at the beginning of the experiment. Moreover, recent work that was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences showed that in the pasture system, which is this green bar compared to the other systems, more of that was in the stabilized form, that mineral associated organic matter form. As I talked about earlier, that's when we talk about sequestered carbon, we want to see it in that MEOM form. So let me just wrap up here by saying annual cropping systems in our part of the world, and I'll just say that I'm currently digging into the literature to try and get my hands around all the papers that sort of meet all those criteria that I laid out. It's not just our work that's showing this. Most annual cropping systems are either not changing or losing soil carbon over time. And we're very concerned about this and very concerned that it might be a signal of a changing climate. We have to be wary of soil carbon studies that don't account for all the inputs and outputs. They're incomplete, that compare the effective management practices only at a single point in time, that only look in the surface horizons and don't account for equivalent soil mass. And then, as I said, my drum to beat is that systems that gain soil carbon, they must continuously cover the soil, eliminate soil disturbance, tillage, grow dense and fibrous roots, and recycle nutrients. And these are perennial grasslands. We have these systems in hand now. They're productive, they're profitable. We need more of it on the landscape. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Randy. Really appreciate that presentation. Now we're going to hear from Mike on a little different angle, focus more on nitrogen dynamics in these systems.
Great, thanks, Craig. Let's see here, take a second to get my slides going. Yeah, thanks. So I'll speak a little bit about nitrogen in the environment. So nitrogen is critical to productivity, profitability, and without better managing it, we really will not make the gains in environmental performance that we're targeting over the coming decades. So like Randy here, I'll start off with 3 main points that I'll go through individually through the next few minutes. So nitrogen, not carbon, accounts for most of the greenhouse gas emissions from the Corn Belt, and also most of the environmental concerns beyond just greenhouse gas emissions. Perhaps the most pressing environmental concern of corn and soybean production in the Midwest is nitrate losses downstream. Yet we know nitrogen is absolutely critical to soil health and human health. Without it, many of us wouldn't be here today without nitrogen fertilizer synthesis. Second point I want to make is that nitrous oxide emissions from fertilizer offset most of the potential to draw carbon out of the atmosphere and store it in those soil pools that you just heard about from Randy. And so Really, as a result of these, we have to optimize nitrogen management if we're to maintain and increase productivity, profitability, and environmental performance in the future. Really, nitrogen underpins all three of those outcomes that I think all of us want. So just to start off broadly, this is a study from the National Academy of Sciences showing the greenhouse gas emission sources in the absence of changes in soil carbon. So what are the greenhouse gas emission sources from US corn production across the United States? And here we can see that nitrogen fertilizer in the orange, and also the synthesis of nitrogen fertilizer, all the energy that goes into making that fertilizer, they account for roughly 2/3 of the greenhouse gas emissions from corn production. Even a little bit more when you start to think about nitrous oxide emissions associated with biomass decay on the soil surface, crop residues as well. More specifically, if we look at a corn system in Iowa, we could go through some of the numbers here. So in the rain-fed corn belt, the northern corn belt, roughly 3% of nitrogen fertilizer is lost as nitrous oxide, which is a potent greenhouse gas. I'll describe just how potent it is in a second. So if we have 170 kilograms or 150 pounds of nitrogen per acre, roughly an average nitrogen fertilizer application, about 7 pounds per acre is going to be emitted in nitrous oxide emissions. So that's a little bit more than 3%, but that's when we put the oxygens that are in N2O or nitrous oxide back into the weight of that. That 3% is 3% of the nitrogen that's lost as nitrous oxide emissions. So these 7 pounds per acre or 8 kilograms of nitrous oxide per hectare are equivalent to the emissions of 2.4 metric tons of CO2 equivalents per hectare per year, or nearly 1 metric ton per acre per year. So how do we get from 8 kilograms of nitrous oxide to 2.4 metric tons of CO2 per hectare per year? The answer is that nitrous oxide traps roughly 1 pound of nitrous oxide in the atmosphere, traps roughly 300 times the amount of heat of 1 pound of CO2 in the atmosphere. As a result, when we scale that up, we get that large number there. So to put this into perspective for everybody here, many of you have heard about the potential for going from a tilled field to a no-tilled field to, in fact, draw down carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and store it in the soil. The maximum rate that's been shown that we could do that in the northern corn belt is about 1.8 metric tons of CO2 per hectare per year, or about 3/4 of a metric ton per acre. Obviously, when we take the difference of those, that results still in net emissions, net positive greenhouse gas emissions from the system of more than 0.5 metric ton per hectare, or about 1/4 metric ton per acre per year. So how do these emissions occur, and what can we do about them? So if we look at this figure here, I want to highlight that soil carbon storage, in addition to the fact that it has a lower potential for greenhouse gas mitigation than nitrous oxide emissions, is that soil carbon storage may be temporary. Whereas if we avoid emissions of nitrous oxide to the atmosphere, that's a permanent avoidance. In other words, those emissions will never occur. So if we look at this figure here, on the y-axis, we have the amount of soil carbon that's in the soil. Higher, the more carbon in the soil. So, and then we have time on the x-axis down at the bottom. So if we start at a point in time and we have a cropping system, let's say it's a tilled system, a conventional tilled system in Iowa, and we decide to switch to no-till, a practice that many people think will draw down carbon dioxide from the atmosphere by increasing the amount of soil stored in the carbon. We will increase carbon in that soil in an exponential rise to a plateau. So I want to highlight here that the amount of carbon, as Randy discussed, that we can store in the soil is finite. It will reset at a new equilibrium upon that change in tillage. And that'll take about somewhere between 10 to 30 years, the research shows. Now, what happens? Many of our croplands in the northern corn belt are rented. What happens if a new renter comes along and decides to abandon that no-till practice and return to a tilled field? Well, the carbon loses at an even faster rate than we accrue it, and it goes right back to where it was in the beginning. That carbon that we stored literally goes back up in smoke to CO2 to the atmosphere. In contrast to that, I want to highlight that if we avoid nitrous oxide emissions due to a change in fertilizer management, improvements in fertilizer management, those will always be avoided. They'll never be released to the atmosphere. So despite all this, nitrogen fertilizer is absolutely critical for soil health. I mentioned human health, we're all aware, productivity, profitability, and environmental performance. And really, to reach all those things through nitrogen fertilizer management, to achieve those goals, we really need to apply the optimum nitrogen fertilizer rate for productivity. So research shows that if we apply the optimum fertilizer rate, shown in the middle of the figure here, that we optimize the soil carbon stocks. So without nitrogen fertilizer, we do not have the optimum soil carbon or the highest levels of soil carbon we can achieve in corn and soybean croplands. We also know that similar relationships apply to nitrate leaching downstream, as well as nitrous oxide emissions to the atmosphere, particularly when we scale those on a per bushel basis. So if we look at things like nitrate leaching per bushel or nitrous oxide emissions per bushel, they generally are minimized around the optimum nitrogen fertilizer rate. So we really do want to be at the optimum nitrogen fertilizer rate for productivity, profitability, and environmental performance. So that begs the question, what is the optimum nitrogen fertilizer rate? If it's that easy, let's just do it, right? And this is the challenge, is that it's not that easy. So on the figure here, on the x-axis, we're looking at the optimum nitrogen fertilizer input. On the y-axis, we're looking at the grain yield that's achieved, the amount of corn we produce in bushels at that optimum nitrogen fertilizer input. This data is limited from about 10 years and 15 sites in central Iowa. And what you can see is that each point represents the outcome of an experiment that measures what the economic and agronomic optimum nitrogen fertilizer rate is for production that I just showed on that previous slide. And it varies enormously. You can see how much it varies by more than 100 pounds of nitrogen per acre per year. So what do we do in the context of all this variability? Right now, we don't do much. This is our best nitrogen fertilizer recommendation. The 7 universities that represent over half the corn production in the United States, shown there on the right, all subscribe to the same nitrogen fertilizer recommendation system. And they basically recommend the average of the outcome of those trials. So in other words, some people are under applying, and on a per bushel basis, we're losing more nitrogen to the environment than we could if they moved the fertilizer rate up to the optimum. On the other hand, we have people that are applying way too much fertilizer for their optimum over here. And we know, unfortunately, that environmental losses ramp up exponentially once you go past that optimum rate. So bringing both people who are applying below the optimum rate down to the optimum rate and the people applying above the optimum rate back to the optimum rate, we would reduce environmental losses significantly. So what? Right, the uncertainty, more than 100 kilograms per hectare per year, roughly 90 pounds per acre per year from field to field, year to year. At present, we have no way to predict that variability, although folks have tried, and I'll get to that in a minute, some solutions. And then at that average optimum nitrogen input, there's still a large nitrogen surplus that we need to clean up. So by just improving nitrogen fertilizer management within the field, we will not achieve all our environmental goals as well. And so I want to talk about a couple of solutions that we have for these challenges. So how do we reduce the optimum nitrogen input and the greenhouse gas emissions associated with that nitrogen input? Because as I mentioned, we have to have the optimum nitrogen input to reduce environmental impacts on a per bushel basis while maximizing productivity and profitability for our farmers and users of the food supply. But on the other hand, at that optimum level, there are still some losses from the system, particularly downstream leaching losses that I mentioned earlier on that we need to clean up. So what can we do about those? One approach we are taking now at Iowa State University is we're applying very recent advances in precision agriculture technologies through public-private partnerships to literally conduct hundreds of experiments on real operational farms every year. And so what you're looking at in this aerial photo from a drone is an experiment that's been laid out on a farmer's field. The farmer did this experiment themselves with their own management. It didn't cause any hiccups. It just gets programmed into the natural activities of their tractors. And these yellow rectangles are relatively low nitrogen rates that were put into the field. And you can see the impact of under-fertilizing corn right here. The productivity is lower. And as you can imagine, that's not an ideal situation. Now, conducting literally hundreds of these trials every year will be a transformational approach to nitrogen management, because in addition to these advances in precision agriculture that have come online in the past few years, there have also been enormous advances in data science and modeling capabilities using things like artificial intelligence and machine learning that can be applied to these once we have the enormous data sets that we can collect through these public-private partnerships on research farms. But as I mentioned, this can't solve the complete problem, right? We need to take a systems approach, and a systems approach is really critical, I think, to all our research here. Don't want to speak for Randy and Anna, but I think they would agree to that. And we need to think about these cropping systems as systems beyond just the boundary of the fields or the boundary of an individual crop at a certain period of time. And so here we just have kind of an idealized Northern Corn Belt, Minnesota, Iowa, Illinois crop production system. So we have a crop field. Many of our fields are artificially drained to enable profitable crop production. And we can take advantage of these drains, often associated with negative environmental impacts of leaching, to actually reduce a lot of the nitrogen losses from these systems. So much of the nitrogen losses are in dissolved forms downstream. Obviously, many of the folks on the webinar today are familiar with Gulf hypoxia, the drinking water challenges we have in the Northern Corn Belt as well, owing to nitrate losses. Our most effective practices for reducing nitrate losses, fertilizer management is certainly important, but these edge of field strategies, we call them, that treat the nitrate losses after they're lost from the field, but before they go downstream. Research at Iowa State University shows that roughly 1 to 3% of the watershed being taken out of production and put into a denitrification wetland can reduce nitrate losses from the system by more than 70%. That would easily meet our Gulf of Hypoxia Task Force goals, while also adding quite a bit of biodiversity back to the landscape and potentially some carbon storage as well with the perennial grasses associated with the edges of those wetlands. So with that, thank you for listening, and I'll look forward to some questions and discussions at the end.
Thanks so much, Mike. Appreciate that connection between nitrate and soil carbon. And now we'll finish up with Anna, who's going to talk about soil health, something that Ken and I in EWG are extremely encouraged by the attention to soil health.
Thanks, Craig. So I think my role here is to kind of spread it out into a bigger picture. I think that's what soil health does conceptually, is it takes these individual either environmental issues or agronomic issues, and it puts them in a larger context. So as I think they said in the beginning, I work for the University of Minnesota. I'm an extension professor, which means my educational component isn't focused on undergrads, it's focused on the community in Minnesota, including farmers and their advisors. So I think this older figure gives us a good sense of the broad perspective of soil functions besides just carbon and nitrogen. It illustrates that we really depend on the soil, and it points to the farmer as that intermediary or steward whose actions might have consequences for all of us. And I guess I'll also say that a lot of the ideas I'm presenting here have been shaped by my few years here in Minnesota working with farmers, listening to their questions and their concerns. So to protect the soil, to implement soil health, we use these principles. These principles are really based on the goals of building soil organic matter and soil health. And systems which incorporate all of these principles are relatively rare on the landscape, but there is growing interest. The first one is just to keep the soil covered. This keeps the soil from washing or blowing away. The second is to minimize disturbance, which preserves natural soil structure and also reduces erosion. I'll talk a little bit more about structure later. Increasing crop diversity, it feeds the below ground organisms a more diverse diet. It also gives the farmer a little bit of buffer. If you have a diverse crop rotation, you have diverse crop markets. So these soil health principles are based on biophysical principles, but they end up having socioeconomic implications. The next one, keeping a living root in the ground, really integrates those top three. If you're going to have a living root in the ground all year, you need a diverse set of crops, and you're obviously not going to disturb that cover of the soil. The last one, integrating livestock, can get pretty complicated in the number of ways it can affect the system. You have manure as a carbon source. You have a diverse revenue source if you're selling livestock. And it allows you to grow forage crops, which are important for integrating the first four principles, while feeding them to something that is going to make you money. So these principles are all components of systems that increase soil carbon, and many of them are also going to help you retain your nitrogen too. Randy presented some research how the incremental piecemeal adoption of these practices is less likely to increase carbon. Those grain systems he showed are less likely to increase carbon, but altogether, they're mimicking the natural ecosystems that built soil carbon, grasslands and forests that he also kind of pounded the drum on, as he likes to say. This figure on the left shows how soil health is kind of increasing the framing of the role of soil. So if you start in that middle circle, you can think of just soil fertility as being these concrete quantitative outcomes, yield and profit. As you move out to the green circle, you're still in pretty quantitative or comprehensible outcomes, air quality, water quality, things we can measure. And then you move out to the larger blue circle and you're thinking about these bigger services that soil might provide, including cultural services, human health, biodiversity, and climate buffering services. That climate buffering piece is increasingly important in the soil health conversation, I would say. Soil health has spurred a lot of conversations because it really is a metaphor. And that allows us to discuss this more complete set of expectations from the soil. And I think the conversations about what makes a soil good that just defining soil health have instigated are in themselves productive. A simpler way of defining your soil health is asking whether it provides the functions you expect. So in this flow chart, each function is kind of delineated by a question. Does your soil blow or flow away? Does it allow water to soak in quickly? If your water can't soak in and drain out, then the soil is probably not healthy. You go down that right-hand path. The bottom two questions, you see some crop functions that are really of interest to a farmer. Does your crop recover nutrients? Are there areas where plants die? And those are important things to a farmer, important functions of the soil. You could remake this flow chart for a different context, and I think that's important for soil health. If you're looking at a pasture or a wetland, perhaps some of your questions might be different, but the framework of defining the functions you expect from your soil and estimating the health based on those functions, I think is still relevant. I mostly work in croplands, and I'm going to discuss a couple of these functions that are really relevant to croplands in more detail. So these are current images of wind and water erosion in Minnesota, where I work. That one on the left was taken in southeast Minnesota just this week, where we've had some really high winds and seen some crop damage because of it. This is really the baseline. If your soil is leaving the field with wind or water, it's not healthy, it's not sequestering carbon, it's not supporting your crop, and it's not doing anything for nitrogen use efficiency. This sediment that blows away, I measured that 1/2 pound of nitrogen per day could blow away along a mile of road in the flatlands of Northwest Minnesota. And so these strong winds and intense rains that are partly brought on by climate change are really only exacerbating our vulnerability of our croplands to erosion. A lot of these events happen in times of year when we don't generally have something growing in a corn soybean rotation. So this is really the first priority in terms of resource concerns. This gets, once we have a crop growing or once the water gets down into the soil, presuming it doesn't run off the surface, there's a really striking tale told by the water behavior. So we want some really diverse functions from our soil in terms of water. We want the soil to let water in when it rains, and we want the soil to store water when it's dry. And to do that, we need the soil structure that's kind of shown here on the right with these crumbly bits. So those top 2 circle pictures represent looking down at the surface of the soil, and the one on the right has a lot of soil aggregates, which are the little clumps you can see. The soil on the left is not aggregated, so it looks smooth as you look down on the surface photo. And that might happen if you break up soil aggregates by tillage, because that tends to break up the natural structure. So the little black bubbles and blue lines below those represent a cutaway picture of the soil. So that arrow going down represents where rain is hitting the surface of the soil. And on the left, where you don't have very much aggregation, the little blue lines representing rain can't get very far into the soil because the bubbles are small and close together. Those particles aren't leaving a lot of airspace between them. And that's where you're going to get runoff. In real life, on the left, that's kind of what this looked like. This soil is regularly tilled. There was a wheel track there from planting in wet weather. And when water hit that surface, it's going to run down that hill. This isn't a steep hill, but there's not enough space between the soil particles to let the water in. So in contrast on the right, when you have the soil aggregates, the particles are bigger and therefore the spaces are bigger. The water can get in. The other thing that soil aggregates give you is represented by those little blue polka dots on top of the aggregate cartoons. And those are the pores where water can be stored inside the aggregates. So as I said, we want not just water infiltration, but also water storage. Those are really diverse functions. And to get that, we need the natural structure of soil that gives you the small pores that hold water and the big pores that let water through. So next, I'm going to talk specifically about cover crops for a few minutes. By this, I mean a crop that isn't harvested. It's generally planted outside the summer annual growing season. Cover crops integrate many of those soil health principles. It's an opportunity for plant diversity. It gives you living roots at a time when you otherwise wouldn't, and it certainly covers the soil. But these 2 photos represent 2 comparisons between cover crops and non-cover cropped fields. So on the left, I think we can all see which one is the cover crop field and which one is the tilled no cover crop field. But in this contrast on the right, there's a lot of weeds, there's some residue on the surface. It's hard to tell actually which one had a cover crop planted and which one didn't. And when a farmer implements cover crops, it may represent a drastic change in management as this system on the right, or it may represent a pretty minor difference in the whole environment. So when we say cover crops are on the landscape, and you may see really drastically different reports in how well cover crops work, it may be because they've been implemented in really different ways. That can come down to how they're planted. It can come down to what species are planted, what other factors are in the operation. So cover crops are kind of this middle ground, an incremental change, which can definitely reduce erosion by giving you some ground cover, but things can change faster. You can get more carbon sequestration, certainly, if you're fully doing all of the soil health principles. There are some other benefits of cover crops besides just carbon sequestration. I borrowed these charts from a website called Ag Evidence that the Nature Conservancy put together, and it compiles many different scientific studies on different agricultural practices and environmental outcomes. So it's really fun to play around in if you're interested in seeing what all the literature together says. The way you read these charts, let's start on the carbon side, is that each one of these little lines represents one study in the upper Midwest. and this line represents the mean outcome. In this case, they're showing the percent change in a given metric due to cover crop incorporation. So the percent change in carbon here. The average change is a little bit positive, which is the green favorable side for carbon. But one thing I notice here is that there's just about as many studies showing a positive change in carbon due to cover crops as there are showing a negative change in carbon due to cover crops. So we're really right about at average in this case. When you look at nutrient runoff, and this gets more at the ideas that Mike was talking about, the significant problem of losing nitrogen from our farm fields in the Midwest, you can see that in most cases, adding cover crops reduce nutrient runoff, which in this case is the favorable outcome. And so this benefit is much more reliably shown by the data we have from studies in the upper Midwest. These others I'm not going to talk about too specifically, but just want to give you a sense that in some cases, the cover crop benefit is really consistent and reliable. In some cases, it's a little bit more variable. Here in the case of reducing soybean cyst nematode, it's a little bit more reliable. Another interesting cover crop outcome might be reducing variability across our landscape. So this study took place in Kentucky. Corn was planted after many years of grass on this soil, and a corn and cover crop system was in place for a couple years. Based on that data and weather modeling, they estimated the presence of the cover crop reduced yield variability, especially in the middle of the slope area. So this back slope, this sloped part of the landscape, isn't likely to be a really productive part of a farmer's cropland. It's a naturally eroding landscape, right? This is where sediment and water are moving. So if you can reduce variability in your less productive areas, that's going to increase productivity and stability across the board. In this case, they attribute that cover crop benefit to water supply during the reproductive stage of the crop. And that's probably coming back to a soil structure benefit, as I described. So I'm going to wrap up and summarize here and say that healthy soil is really all about soil function. I think improving soil structure can be seen as the mechanistic heart of that function. That can lead to reduced erosion and nutrient loss. It can lead to increased resilience and stability across the landscape, which is good for the farmer's bottom line. And all of these functions are reliant on soil carbon. So as we develop policy to support farmer stewardship, I just encourage you to keep these big picture benefits in mind, some of these baseline resource issues that are sometimes superseded by their elemental neighbors, carbon and nitrogen. But these are the baseline of having healthy soil. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much, Anna, and thanks again to Randy and Mike and Anna for all of you sharing your research and knowledge. I have been getting some questions as you've been speaking, so I'll start with those. But please keep sending questions my way and I'll handle them as they come in. The first issue, I've had a couple of questions about whether the slides will be shared. And I just let you know that this session is being recorded and we're more than happy to share that recording. If you're interested in getting a hold of the actual slides, send me an email at Craig, C-R-A-I-G, @ewg.org, and I'll talk with the individual panelists to help get a hold of those slides. So Anna, I'm going to start with you because there was a question that came in earlier. I think you may have already answered it to some extent, but the question was, so do cover crops offer no long-term carbon storage feasibility or opportunity?
It doesn't seem likely that they are going to rapidly increase carbon in a way that mitigates climate change. I think that you might see soil benefits from them. And if your system is really dedicated to producing cover crops, possibly to the detriment of your cash crop, like you're planting a short season annual crop and really trying to get the most biomass from your cover crop, you might get there, but it's not the fastest way. It's not the surefire way. I think you should focus on cover crops for those water quality benefits that they're really reliable in providing.
Thank you. And I just got another question that came in, so I'll stick with you, Anna. The question is, could you briefly explain the benefit of food forests on soil health and carbon sequestration?
I think by food forest, they're talking about maybe an agroforestry element where you're looking at planting woody species that have food value, like hazelnuts or berries or fruit trees. These aren't systems that I work in a lot, and they tend to be systems that are managed on kind of a human scale. So for, you know, a few acres of somebody's personal project, I think they can be really beneficial. They're environmentally, as far as I know, fairly friendly, I believe, because they tend to keep the ground covered and have this these diverse species there. I don't work a lot with them, so that's probably all I can say.
Thanks. I'm going to go to you now, Randy. There was a few related questions. The first one is, why does pasture have more stabilized carbon, or more MOM or however you pronounce that?
Yes, it's a great question, and that's why we have a phalanx of grad students who are trying to peel that onion. But for sure, it's related to some combination of the soil health principles that Anna laid out. One, that the system has continuous living cover, the perennial grassland does, and so we're not losing carbon through erosion. The second is no doubt related to the fact that the soil is not disturbed. There's no tillage. Even with cover crops, even with strip till and conservation tillage, and a lot of these interventions that are meant to help reduce erosion, we're still, and just planting, frankly, we're still disturbing the soil occasionally, where we break up fungi, we break up roots, and reduce the ability of the soil to hold on to carbon. The third is that the perennial grasslands are constantly putting in roots into the system below ground to a much higher degree than the annual cropping systems. And those roots are constantly turning over, that is dying, sloughing, putting exudates into the system. And one of the real frontiers of soil science is to understand how that constant input of carbon is stimulating microbial activity that is creating more microbial necromass. Okay, so that's a big thing. And then finally, the fact that there are livestock in the system recycling carbon and nutrients through manure and excreta back into the system constantly in a sort of titrated way, in a way that's consistently happening and distributing that around the system, as opposed to when we bring manure in one big pulse, you know, in the fall or in the spring and put it on the system. So we're kind of constantly metering those nutrients back into the system. So I can't say it's one of those and not the others. It's a combination of all those things, which is why I wave my arms about, hey, grasslands, they're great.
Well, a bit of a corollary to that question is, does the mineral composition of the soil itself affect the capacity to stabilize carbon?
Yes, absolutely. So the amount of silt, the amount of clay, the type of clay, these are all really important nuances. What we know is that soils that developed underneath prairie have a much higher capacity, or a much higher amount of those particles, and so much higher ability to hold on to carbon. That's why the Corn Belt is the Corn Belt. It's got all this accumulated cation exchange capacity that allows a lot of that carbon to accumulate and glom on.
More about pasture to you, Randy. What do you think about the trade-offs between sequestering carbon in pasture and the methane emissions from livestock themselves?
Well, I just published a paper in Ag and Environmental Letters that addresses this very issue, and I'll put the link in the chat if that's helpful, and Craig can make the paper available later, or people can email me for it. But the bottom line is, if we took all of the corn and beans that are fed to livestock now in the US, plus a lot of the corn that we use to make ethanol, if we took that land and put it in perennial grassland, it would likely accumulate carbon to a degree that would offset the methane emissions from the livestock. Now that's a big arm wavy, you know, and that's what this paper is. It's a big arm wavy back of the envelope kind of thing, but it really is meant to get people to think about this. And it's not to say that we should, you know, try and eat as much meat as we are now and maybe even increase it. I'm not going to go down that road. Certainly, we should probably reduce our meat consumption to try and reduce methane emissions. But the bottom line is there is capacity to have grassland that offsets the methane emissions from the livestock. So I'll put that link in the chat.
One last to you, Randy, then I'll leave you alone for a while. But the do you know of any long-term studies of carbon sequestration or accumulation in agroforestry systems? Or maybe anyone on the panel?
I can't say that I know of long-term, meaning more than a decade. I know that the Savannah Institute in the upper Midwest is just embarking on establishing those baselines and working with a lot of folks at land grants around the upper Midwest. And also the Center for Agroforestry at University of Missouri has some similar experiments underway. But I can't say that I know of any existing long-term data.
Thanks. So now we've got a couple questions that are leaving the field of soil science. So the first interesting question is, are any of you involved in or hoping to be involved in USDA's Climate and Smart Commodities program?
Well, since I'm yammering so much, I'll say that we certainly put in an application. So I help lead this project that Anna's part of called Grassland 2.0. And the Grassland 2.0 group got together and put together a climate smart agriculture proposal that's very much focused on these things that I've been talking about. Converting a lot of our annual grain cropland into well-managed perennial grassland. Because so much of the annual cropland is just generating feed for livestock, why don't we just put the livestock out there and let them feed themselves?
Mike, are you involved in the Smart Commodities program at all?
I was involved in an application, and it'll be interesting to see who gets funded when they come out.
So moving even farther away in the field of soil science, there's a question about, the person doesn't understand why, if all this science is out there and so clear, that USDA says carbon sequestration on ag lands needs more study, but is still a worthy thing to pursue and spend a great deal of money subsidizing or incentivizing work to sequester carbon.
I can start on that from the angle of why the practices aren't widely adopted. Farmers who are invested in a corn soybean annual system have a big hurdle to switch to a different kind of system. And that hurdle involves not only their decision and their knowledge about how to farm, but it involves the people who farm with them, their family or their employees. It involves where they get their supplies, be that local retailers or seed and fertilizer companies. And it involves but I actually think that that first part of them deciding, of making kind of an emotional switch, is a big deal. And so we've gone a long way down the road of investing our whole infrastructure and our communities in a corn soybean rotation. And it's going to take the whole community swinging the other way to support land managers doing different systems.
I can pile on to that if I may. One of the first sentences of our climate smart proposal was that one of the hardest things to overcome if we think about transforming the system is the current payment insurance subsidy system that kind of codifies and keeps in place and makes resilient the current system that has so many problems. And so it's not just the farmer decision making, there's this massive macroeconomic push for them to stay in the current system, as well as these social elements that Anna brings up, as well as economic elements, et cetera.
Craig, I'll add to that. I think a theme that people could see in all three of our presentations is that there is an enormous amount of variability in the system. And we really need to stop managing for the average and moving towards managing for field and year specific operations to optimize those. You could use the analogy of individualized healthcare, right? It's a very, very similar concept, and hopefully we can go there in the future.
There's one last question so far, which is even farther afield from soil science. And I'm curious is how you think about sequestration in the soil and how that relates to other carbon capture and sequester proposals. I'm sure that you've heard about for industry, and the most current one here in the Corn Belt is the CO2 pipelines from ethanol plants. I mean, do you, I think the questioner is asking, do you see the efforts to sequester carbon in the soil sort of at odds with the notion of pumping CO2 from ethanol plants and storing it somewhere? You can refuse to answer if you.
Well, I'll just, I'm not an expert in those, so-called BECCS or carbon capture systems. But I will say what's at odds and doesn't make sense is that the idea that we're going to stabilize climate simply by capturing more carbon. If we don't turn off the spigot, or at least reduce the spigot big time of fossil fuel combustion, no amount of carbon capture by soils or pipelines or ethanol plants is gonna get us to where we need to be in terms of stabilizing carbon in the atmosphere. So that to me is the elephant in the room. The things that we talk about doing, whether it's cover crops or no-till or grazed grassland, the things that we talk about to promote carbon accumulation in soils and ag systems, they all have these massive benefits for water quality and biodiversity and other things. And so we should be doing them anyway. And if it happens to capture some carbon along the way, that's a good thing, but that's not the thing that's going to help stabilize climate, in my view.
I think that's a good place to end, unless Mike or Anna, you want to add anything to Mandy's comments? Well, once again, I'd really like to thank the three of you for being here today, for all the work you've done to understand soil carbon and all the work you did to put these presentations together. It's been an absolute pleasure working with you. And I want to thank all the participants for sticking with us. This science is difficult, it's challenging. It takes some work to understand, but I think it's absolutely essential to moving us in the right direction in this absolutely critical issue about stabilizing the climate and the role agriculture can play. So I'm ready to sign off, unless Ken, you'd like to make some closing comments.
Well, just thank you, Craig, for pulling this panel together, and to all the participants. Just deeply appreciative. We really wanted to convene these experts and hear from them, because we've learned much about this issue and how to think about it from Randy and Mike and Anna. So thank you. We'll continue to provide access to studies as they emerge on this topic. Yes, one of the main things, to go back to my opening point, is EWG is here to make sure that we make investments to preserve the agricultural systems that we rely on. And in the past, we have spent a lot of time and a lot of effort fighting for the funds and for the program elements that can do that. In the case of the more recent interest, which we welcome, in the role of agriculture in climate change, we frankly did have concerns that some of the approaches were being oversold, that the role of sequestering carbon, while an important scientific topic, when you dug down a little bit more, as we did with these panelists today, revealed that it probably wasn't the straightforward approach that we sometimes read about, of just increasing soil organic matter equals soil carbon sequestration, ignoring nitrogen, not understanding the importance of an integrative approach. And I guess the upshot of all of that was we wanted to bring the science forward that has helped us understand just how complex this is. We're concerned that there's a tremendous interest in cover cropping, but there's not much cover cropping. And cover cropping has been recommended to farmers and has been supported with financial assistance for decades and decades. EWG, just speaking for us, we're committed to making this next farm bill as productive as we possibly can in facing agriculture's climate challenges. A lot of that feels to us like it's investments that can help farmers be more resilient to climate change, even if they can't contribute in the short term or meaningfully in the long term, even without dramatic changes in how they farm, to carbon capture and sequestration. We think this is in itself important. We salute Secretary Vilsack for launching his initiative to learn more about these systems. Every time we've done that, it's led to a major change in agricultural policy when we focused on the soil, starting with the New Deal, the Resource Conservation Act in 1977, that was for the first time we looked at soil erosion in a fairly sophisticated way. The 1985 Farm Bill that built the foundation that we're hoping to build on going forward, and we have in every subsequent Farm Bill. So there's a long history here, a long commitment, and we really wanted to make sure it was informed by the best available science. So we'll continue this conversation. Mike, Anna, Randy, thank you so much for giving us the benefit of your long experience and expertise. I'm sure there'll be a lot of follow-up questions. We'll try and get those to you as best we can. And thank everyone who participated. We have dozens of participants still on the line, and look forward to any questions you might have in follow-up. And finally, again, thanks to Craig for not just for putting this panel together, but for his decades of leadership in bringing these concerns to policymakers and to the public.